that 2.5% of total voters stayed home on election day, correct?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm trying in that report just to show whether or not we needed some historically ridiculously high, significant number to show up. But I was looking at that 2.5, and I think it's probably the least significant number to look at. It's whether or not they could historically, and from what people told us, whether or not election day vote could have increased as a share of the overall electorate by what it would have needed to in order for it to have changed the outcome.
Okay, and other than your projection, you don't have any evidence that 2.5% of total voters stayed home on election day?
Well, not just a projection,
everything that goes into your projection.
Including what people told us and their vote history, and yeah.
So, but it's your projection, right?
Well, sure.
And you're not offering any opinion that 2.5% of total voters stayed home on election day because of tabulator issues, correct?
Well, my opinion is it's when you look at Joe voter, where for politicos, it might be a little hard to understand how, average people would react if they were listening to their friends or they saw on social media, they saw news reports. There were widespread issues and that deterred people from voting, or if there were long lines people couldn't wait in. It's easy to see how people walk away. Not everyone is so intense about politics that life can't be put aside. Life gets in the way.
So is that a no? You're not offering an opinion that 2.5% of total voters stayed home on election day because of tabulator issues?
Maybe not, oh, no, let me clear that up. What I am saying,
you said no.
No, it's no, because I'm trying to explain that it is my opinion that the problems that people heard about and the issues they experienced, and that is 2.5%, not that much to 40,000 voters. That is my opinion, absolutely, from what people told us. And the percent that was missing from the poll. Again, at all the exit polls we have ever conducted, you don't see missing participants like this without something happening, some other variable getting thrown into the equation.
You're not offering an opinion that any specific percentage of voters stayed home as a result of tabulator issues on election day, are you?
A range. Yes, I gave a range. I mean, I can't give nobody can give a specific number. I can only give you, an idea of whether or not it's mathematically, or not even just whether or not the range that is reasonable, we can conclude with a degree of mathematical certainty that this affected this chunk of voters. Is that enough to have changed the outcome? And I am offering the opinion that range is enough to.
So you're offering a range, not a specific number, correct?
That's correct. You can, yes.
Okay, let's talk about some of the math that you did, and you don't have to bear with me. Lawyers are notoriously bad at math. Okay, so you do a calculation based on what would have happened if 2.5% more voters turned out, 2.5% additional voters, not as a proportion of turnout as we talked about.
That's correct.
And you give a projection of what would have happened in the election had those people turned out and voted on election day, right?
Yes, it would only be election day voters.
Okay. And that calculation that you do, you said 2.5% is about 39,000 more voters. Does that sound right?
Well, I know, yes, it does. But the 2.5% is, you really shouldn't focus on that. The point is the range of the share of election day vote. How many voters would have needed to turn out? How many more voters to push the overall share of the election day voter, as opposed to those who dropped off in a box, those who voted by mail, to push it within a certain, basically I'm looking for the low of my range. So we estimated it would be over 1/5, could be a quarter of the vote was election day vote, as by the way, model 1 does in the 2022 Maricopa plan. It could have been that high, which would have pushed election day voters from 250 roughly to 300, much closer to 300. I'm looking for the bottom of that range, which is roughly 20 to 22%.
I understand that you're looking at a range. I understand your opinion. I'm not asking you about that. I just want to talk about the actual calculation that you did.
Okay.
So the number that you used was 2.5%, and that was about 39,000 more votes on election day. Does that sound right to you?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay. As of election day, there were 2.5 million registered voters in Maricopa. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Of those, 1.3 million had already voted before election day, right? Those are all those early votes that were already cast.
Leaving about 900, a little less than 900,000 voters who would have been eligible to vote. That's true.
You're gonna need to fix my math if this is wrong, but 2.4 minus 1.3, I think, is about 1.1 million voters.
What did you say that again?
We said there were 2.4 million total registered voters in Maricopa.
Yeah, but we have to remove the election day votes. Go ahead.
I understand what you're saying.
Yes.
Well, let's just take it step by step so we're on the same page. So of those 2.4 million, 1.3 million had already voted by election day. That's those early voters, non-election day voters, correct?
There was more than that, though, if you count those who dropped by Dropbox
and
voted in person early, right?
Sure, that whole number. So that would have left about 1.1 million voters who could have voted on election day.
Sure.
And we know that 250,000 of those voters did vote on election day.
But nobody has a perfect voter file, so you can't get to 100% turnout. So when the difference between your 1.1 and where I'm going with it's less, is that there are voters who just aren't going to show. These are not high propensity voters. I can't justify that they could have showed up. They don't have the vote history to show up.
I understand. I'm not asking you about that.
Okay.
So I think you said a 900,000 number. Is that what you mentioned just now?
Just now? No.
Okay. So 250,000 people voted on election day. Does that sound right? In Maricopa?
Roughly. Yeah.
Okay. And taking out the number of people who had already voted before election day, so adding that group up with the people who actually did turn out on election day, that leaves about 900,000 voters in Maricopa who ultimately didn't vote in the election. Does that sound right?
Yeah, ballpark. Yeah.
Okay. Now, 2.5% of those voters, that's not 39,000, right?
No.
That's about 22,000.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take your word for it.
I used a calculator.
Yeah.
So we have a ballpark of 22,000 votes.
Yeah.
Using your 2.5%.
Yeah.
Okay. And you say that the vote splits on election day. You give a range, but you say, about 70% broke for Miss Lake and about 30% voted for Governor-elect Hobbs. Is one of the ranges that you use. Is that right?
It's not a.
Not a range. It's a specific number.
Yeah. Yes, there are specific numbers. I was being actually conservative with those numbers. The first tabulated batch from Maricopa was a much higher margin. And just to be clear on the math before, it did 2.5% of what had been voted already, just to show whether it was plausible. It's not a matter of what's left. We know what's left out there as far as who is still eligible to vote. So I wasn't using that 2.5% as that, I see what you were saying, but that's not the relevant math. The relevant math is whether or not there is enough voters to push the overall share of the election day vote. The 2.5% you're focusing on a lot. That's not the point of the number. You didn't pull 2.5% out of the air. I was just trying to show how small of the vote that had been cast would have need to been changed. It's not the relevant number is the percentage of people who did not participate, and whether or not there still would have been enough eligible voters out there that could have pushed the share of the election day voter higher. And then that would have changed the outcome because of the margin. And I didn't pull 70% out of thin air. That is the vote total. She had won among the group of voters we're talking about in question.
Okay, but taking your number, this is the number you reported, and that's the reason I'm using it. I understand that you're saying that there could have been a range, but the number you used was 2.5%. So I just want to make sure we're understanding what that 2.5% actually means. So that's what these questions are about.
I understand.
Okay, so taking your number, the 2.5% of the voters who could have been left to vote on election day, that's actually about 22,000, not 39,000.
I'm talking about the entire electorate with that too, and that you're again, the math is still the math. There was still enough of what the exit poll indicated to us was that it could have been 20% of that 250 that did not show up because of a lack of completion of that questionnaire and because of the issues they reported. Again, if that's the case, would there be 50,000 votes remaining, from those who already voted early versus those who voted by election day? And there would have been 800 plus thousand, and there to speculate that they could have voted by mail. I mean, the mail was done; it's in. There's nothing else to talk about. We're talking about election day. Is there enough? And I'm using that as that 2.5% of the total vote, just to see whether or not it would fall anywhere near that range, and it would.
So you gave some projections. Had 39,000 more people voted on election day, right?
Yes.
39,000 people out of the 250,000 people who did vote on election day. That's about a 16%.
It is.
Okay.
Yes.
So your hypothetical, the number you chose, what you're evaluating is what could have happened in theory if almost 16% more voters had turned out on election day. Is that right?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I mean, it could have, because of the margins, and they did vary. For instance, some of the draw three, she won 80% of those votes. It wasn't 70. I was being conservative with that 70%. The truth is, in the areas that we're talking about that are likely, if you want to call them suppressed, I don't know what term you want to use, but those voters who didn't show because of those lines, in some of those areas, it was higher. I was being conservative with 70%. Miss Lake was winning 76% plus of some of these areas. So it didn't need to be, it might not needed to even have increased by 15%. Or 16.
That's
15.7, maybe something like that. Yeah.
I defer to your math over mine.
15.
Around 16%. Okay, that's actually sort of what you just talked about. It's actually a little bit different than what I was trying to ask you about. So let me just rephrase what I was trying to ask. You had this 39,000 number of 250,000 voters. That's just a raw number of about 16% of that total that actually turned out on election day, right?
Sure.
Okay. So your 2.5% selection, that example that you gave, what that is really saying is what would have happened if 16% more voters had turned out on election day, right?
It is, but that's not unusual in what we do. It's not. It happens.
And so the math, the way you've done it, that basically assumes that 1 out of every 6 voters who was going to vote on election day didn't vote, right?
I guess that's fair. Little less actually, but the truth is, we absolutely can anticipate that could have happened. It's not that many votes. It's not. And if you look, and another thing here is that made me a little bit uncomfortable is how much those numbers would have made the election day vote as a share of the overall electorate. But then when I look at new registrations and who is registering to vote via what is essentially Arizona and Maricopa's permanent absentee ballot, there 25% are not registering to vote by mail. So it seems to me, 10 years ago, Arizona was 80+% all mail. It seems to me that the election day vote is getting more and more of the electorate as time goes on. And I think that probably, the parties, like I said, they employ strategies to get voters to vote different ways. I think it would be folly. American people are unpredictable, and I think it would be folly if that's what the data tells us they were going to do. It would be folly to pretend like we know better.
In your direct testimony, you used the term disenfranchised. What did you mean by that term?
I think if governments can't do everything in their power, there are always problems on election day. There's always going to be something that turns up. But if this was normal, then I would see this in every exit poll I do. This was not normal. This is the first time this has ever happened to me. The first time. So I can only assume these people, I mean, when you hear the frustrations in their voice like we did, there's no other word for it.
Okay, so by disenfranchised, you mean the people who chose not to vote?
I would argue they didn't choose not to vote. Again, they may have chose not to vote early, but that's their right. They chose to vote on election day, and they were not provided ample opportunity to do so. This one gentleman's going to stick in my head forever. He showed up. It was 7:13 in the morning, and he said, I'll vote after work if I can. I don't know if he did or not, and that to be fair, but he didn't take the exit poll.
And I think just one last question for you. You have no knowledge that anyone from Maricopa County or otherwise intentionally tampered with the printers or tabulators, correct?
Not my purview, ma'am. No, correct. Although I will say this, when you look at it by congressional
I'm sorry,
district,
you said.
Oh, no, you're right.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Barris.
Thank you.
You might have a little more time to go. Oh, I'm sorry. A lot more time.
Morning, Mr. Barris.
Good morning.
How long have you been working in the polling industry?
Altogether, about 8 years.
Did you start 8 years ago, or was there a
My
gap?
own 6.
6. Did you start 8 years ago, or was there a gap?
I don't understand what you mean.
So the last 8 years of your professional life, you've been working in the polling industry. Is that
From
correct?
2014 on, polling and elections, correct?
How familiar are you with the challenges to the polling industry, technical and otherwise, that precede 2014?
Only from research, sir.
You testified earlier that even the Associated Press has broken away from traditional polling practices. Is that correct?
That's correct. Traditional exit polling practices, yes.
That was your testimony. Okay. Are you aware that they've also broken away from traditional polling practices from pre-election?
For pre-election day polling? Yes.
Do you know why?
They moved to a different panel, response biases, various, I imagine, like everybody else.
But you're familiar with the technical issues, with the changing behavior of the American people with regard to cell phones rather than
Yes.
landlines, working people out of the home, people answering in the home, random digit dialing, no longer
That's
used
right.
and stuff. Okay. So because of those changes, polling, specifically in the last 25 years, has been notoriously flawed, correct?
Not all of it.
Some of it?
Most of it.
Most of it.
Yes.
Now, as a pollster, you're familiar with the term random sample.
Yes.
And my understanding from your report is that you sampled or attempted to sample 813 voters in the state of Arizona?
No, 813 just in Maricopa.
813 just in Maricopa.
It was a statewide survey. That was what represented Maricopa.
And how many voters in Maricopa?
About 813, yes. And not about 813 who qualified and participated.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear on my question. How many registered voters are there in Maricopa County?
There are about 2.4 and change, almost 2.5, I would say.
And would you say 813 is a sample size that would give you a significant amount of confidence in the outcome of that?
You know, I do. And the reason I would say that is because we're looking at certain subgroups of the population. It is a midterm. So admittedly, not everybody is going to come out and vote. There are people who have vote histories that support that. That's part of projecting this. The projections we use for turnout goes into the sampling errors, the calculations we do for sampling errors. But 813, so there are polls out there right now from before the election that did 800, maybe even less for the state of Arizona, not just Maricopa.
What confidence level did you attribute to your 813 sample size?
About 3.5%.
Plus or minus?
Plus or minus.
And you said there were 2.4 million voters in Arizona?
Yes.
Maricopa County?
But there's not going to be 2.4 projected, to turn out.
What steps did you take in order to ensure that those 813 were selected randomly?
That's a great question. We use a vendor, a national voter file database. And in this case, it is national, but we obviously just stuck to Arizona. And they draw a random sample off of the voter file. And from there, when we contact them, it is randomly selected.
So I understand from your testimony that you did not select the random sample. Is that correct?
Well, of course I did. Well, I mean, it's every vendor.
Just testified that a vendor did. Is that correct?
No, the vendor is the
I would
data
ask that
source.
the,
It is randomly selected.
Okay. So
Your Honor, may I object? I would just ask that counsel allow the witness to finish responding before he interrupts him.
Here's the way it has to work, okay? Your attorneys on the other side are going to have the chance to ask other questions. So, like I said before, wait until the question's completely asked, and there may be an objection. So if you see somebody stand up, it's a clue an objection's coming. Give me a chance to rule on it before you answer.
Yes, Your Honor.
Then I'm going to let Mr. Liddy give him a chance to answer before you ask the next question. But if you're asked a question and you can answer it yes or no, you should answer it yes or no and move on. And then other questioning later will maybe clarify further the answer. Okay. So, next question.
Mr. Barris, I apologize if I misunderstood your response. I now understand your response to be that you got the universe of registered voters from a vendor, but it was you yourself that did the random sampling.
The software does the random sampling for everybody, counselor. Everybody.
For everybody.
All the pollsters, let me rephrase that. All the pollsters I know rely on software to draw random samples from the database. I'm not sure.
Now, when you collect a random sampling, you're going to assume that some of those people that were randomly sampled are not going to participate in the poll, correct?
Absolutely.
So in your original universe, it exceeded 813?
Yes, of course. Yes. If I understand you correctly, yes.
And then you assume that those who declined to participate in your poll and that those who, well, I want to ask a compound question. You will assume that those that you invited to participate in your poll but chose not to, their behavior would be the same as those who did choose to participate in your poll, correct?
Not always. And that's why we're big proponents of larger samples because people are different. And for instance, a more educated voter of the same party would be much more likely to participate than somebody who's non-college educated, even though it's the same party and they may appear to be the same kind of voter.
That's a no?
Yes, but yeah, that's a no. I would imagine. Yes. Go ahead.
So when you get responses, you're not assuming that people who did not respond were going to behave in the same manner as those that did respond. Is that your testimony?
No, and that's mischaracterized. You have, I mean, obviously it's principles of random sampling that you assume that everybody has the same chance and that they will, but we believe in larger samples to reduce that error. That's maybe, I wasn't, that's.
What I'm trying to get at, Mr. Barris, is which is it? Do you make an assumption that those who don't participate in your poll will behave in the same manner as those who do, or do you not make that assumption?
We make the assumption that those who do participate will mirror the behavior of those who don't. Yes.
And particularly, you were interested in tracking the behavior of people by voter registration. Is that correct?
Not only, no.
But it's correct that you were interested in tracking the behavior of people by voter registration?
And for this poll alone, are you, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question. For this poll alone, you're asking if I'm interested in tracking the behavior of registered voters?
Yes, for the issues before this court. Your poll, yeah, that's right.
Yes,
That's my
at the most simple, basic, yes.
I think you testified that in addition to party registration, there are many different variables that can impact the behavior of a voter, correct?
Correct.
Did you test for those in this poll?
Give me an example.
Well, let's say that in a previous election, there was a candidate for statewide office who was registered a Republican prior to 2022. And then in 2022, there was a candidate for statewide office who, upon winning the primary, feigned to have a dagger and slaughter the supporters of that other Republican. Could that being broadcast throughout the state affect the voting patterns of other people that are registered as Republicans that you would anticipate and in fact did vote in 2022?
I got to be honest. I mean, Your Honor, I don't know if I could. That's such an over-the-top example. I don't know if I could make a serious response to that.
Well, you can ask to have a question rephrased if you wish. If you don't understand the question, don't guess. Please say that you can't.
Can we get a there are events that do change voting behavior. Absolutely.
And
if I understand that.
Okay. And are you aware that, as you characterize it, over the top example actually happened? It's not a hypothetical?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And so therefore you did not test for that in your survey, the results of which are here in this court.
Yeah, but if you're suggesting it impacted one group of voters over the other, I can absolutely point to 10 counterexamples where our main problem is not a response bias that would act in the direction that would change the behavior of a voter in the course you're suggesting. I can point to 10 others that would suggest that I have to do my job a lot harder and dig a lot deeper because voters are so terrified to even talk to people and give their opinions anymore. So, I mean.
So it's your professional opinion that registered Republicans in Maricopa County that have a history of voting in every election and have for Senator John McCain every time he was elected and when he ran for president would not have a negative reaction to another Republican running statewide who feigns to slaughter the McCain supporters?
You know what? That's all going to come up in the margins for candidates, you know, and if they tell me they're going to vote, your example's irrelevant, because if you're telling me they're going to vote and they have vote history, they're not going to lie to a pollster. They'll just simply tell me, I'm not going to vote.
Okay, so your opinion is that my example's not going to matter. Is that because every registered Republican is going to vote the same way in every election, regardless of whether the difference of the Republican candidate running for statewide office?
Well, first, let me just clarify. I'm not saying your example doesn't matter. I'm saying I'd catch your example. I'd catch those voters. The vast majority of them, I'm going to catch them. So I'm not going to miss them. They're going to say, no, I'm not voting for this candidate A because of whatever, click. And that's it. Or I'm not going to vote because of it. They'll tell us that. But what was the second part of your question again? What was the follow-up?
I'll accept your answer. Your general conclusion is that fewer Republicans voted on election day than otherwise would have, but for the problems of the printers and perceived problems of the tabulators. Is that correct?
I would say general issues that led to long wait lines. That's what we heard from the voters. No, I can't, just nail down one. That's not my, that's not my purview.
And I believe you testified that your research is based upon your study of the behavior of these registered voters in previous elections in Maricopa County?
Yes, it's fair to say.
And did you track as a variable in your survey the wait lines of other midterm elections, such as 2018 or 2014,
Sure.
2012?
Sure. And compared them to presidential election turnouts as well.
Well, what was the wait time of this
I thought
data you looked at 2012?
I thought when you're saying wait, I thought you meant how much weight is given to turnout for different when you're modeling wait lines, and you're being specific to wait times.
That's correct.
No, I did not study the impact of wait lines in prior elections. I'll see that.
So it's difficult for you to examine your own data from 2022 with regard to registered Republicans voting on election day and 2022 general election because of wait times based on previous behavior of Republicans who voted on election day when you did not look at the wait times in those previous elections.
Well, and in fact, actually, in truth, I did look at some wait lines from the presidential election and 18. I didn't look, in great depth, but I do understand that the wait lines in some areas, reported wait lines, were actually longer in 2020. But I think we have to be clear here that your wait time estimate is not the estimate for people who are waiting online. You're looking at site check to the time that they get a ballot. You're not looking at estimates of people who are wrapped around the corner in a shopping center, a mile long. The county wait estimate is not the true estimate. And the 3-minute estimate is greatly exaggerated by adding election day drop-off ballots into that equation.
Thank you. So is it your testimony that you did not account for the wait times in the midterm elections of 2012, 14, and 18?
I would just say anything beyond a 4-cycle rolling 4-cycle average, which is what we do, I would not have looked at now. And if I may, there's a reason.
No, it's
for
okay.
that.
You already answered the question. I have another one. Is it your understanding that Republican vote out on 22 was low?
Republican vote in 22 was low? No, it was
in
high.
Maricopa County?
It was still high. It was. Turnout was very strong for Republicans in Maricopa.
And to what do you attribute your opinion that it was very strong?
The turnout rates versus the Democratic Party, for instance, Republicans absolutely outvoted Democrats as a turnout rate, 80+%, 80 probably. I haven't looked at the latest because the numbers have changed, but probably I wouldn't be surprised to hear if it hit mid-80s, while Democrats were much lower.
Mid-70s.
Mid-70s? Okay.
Democrats very, very, very high,
69.9.
69.9. Would you be surprised to hear that?
No.
Now, you've said that you base your opinions in part on the previous voting behavior of the subjects of your survey, correct?
Correct.
And I believe your early testimony was that you have perceived a difference in voting behavior of people who vote from the early voting list who vote by mail and people who vote election day. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you base that on examining their voting behavior in previous election cycles?
It's starting now to become a trend, but I base it on the actual vote totals that we're seeing come in, and that's part also on election day. We do get real-time results at my company, so I can actually see as Maricopa tabulates what those election results are. So when I'm going to compare that to our work on the exit poll to see how accurate we were. So for instance, in Maricopa or statewide, what was Ms. Hobbs's margin when all of the early vote was reported, and we'll go and we'll see how close we are in the exit poll, for instance.
So you've based your opinion in part on the previous voting behavior of people who have voted early in Maricopa County as opposed to people who voted on election day. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I would.
And that's
Yeah.
the answer. And did you account for a political party or a political campaign urging voters who already are on the permanent early voting list and have their ballots to not turn them in and vote on election day?
I did try. I mean, we definitely looked at that.
And did you make the assumption that the behavior of voters on the permanent early voting list who have a history of voting early were going to change their behavior in 2022 because now they were going to vote on election day?
A great deal of them told us that. Yes.
So then your assumption that people's behavior tends to be the same, whether they vote early 2 or 3 or 4 cycles back versus 1 year, is non-valid, correct?
No, I think you're misinterpreting. I mean, if they're going to vote at all, they're going to vote based on prior behavior. How they vote by method changes a great deal as time goes on. I would say from 2020 on, we're really experiencing a very drastic change in how people, certain groups, are deciding to vote.
And I think you testified that in Arizona or Maricopa County, I don't think you were clear, but according to your results, that vote by mail is getting less and less and less popular.
Well, I don't know if we can call that a trend yet, but it does appear from the last 2 cycles that it will be. Yes, that's true. Just to be.
Would it surprise you
Not with everybody?
Would it surprise you that early voting popularity has exploded in Arizona?
I don't know. What are you basing that on?
Data, early voters?
Yeah, I would, because the people who registered in the last 2 years, newly registered voters in Maricopa County, are registering to vote less as early vote than had.
Vote went from 75% to 77%.
Well, you know what? That could happen. But and then, like I said, it's still that they're not changing their status. And when we talk to them, they are, as you said before, and you were right, there are people who are, and we can see them on the voter file, they're on the absentee ballot list. But then they tell us, I'm still going to bring my vote on election day. I'm going to bring my ballot. So I think we're just in a process, and maybe it hasn't caught up yet. The data just hasn't.
And you're aware that 84%, are you aware that 84% of the vote in general election in 2022 was early voting?
Yes, combined. Yes, 16% election day.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
That's all the cross-examination? Okay, we desperately need the morning break. We're 35 minutes or 40 minutes past it, so we'll take a 15-minute recess. We will come back at 5 minutes to 11.
All rise. you.